Okay, welcome again to this online masterclass Design Thinking in Higher Education. Before I give the floor to Eveline van Zeeland, I have a few practical remarks. First, I want to ask you all to turn off your microphones. Second, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll make sure Eveline sees them. And finally, for those who are not present today, we'll make a recording of the masterclass. And I will send you a link to the recording afterwards. For those of you who don't know Eveline van Zeeland, Eveline is a teacher, a researcher, a speaker, an entrepreneur, and a book author. She wrote Getting Started with Design Thinking to answer all those questions she couldn't find the answer to in other books about design thinking. And in this masterclass, she will tell you about her insights and experiences with the use of design thinking in higher education. So there you go, Eveline.
Okay, thank you, Wouter. I will share my screen. And yeah, now it's working. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Super. Well, I'm starting with a big I'm sorry, because my laptop ran into a massive update like 1 minute before the previous masterclass was planned. So I'm really, really sorry that I couldn't be there. And thank you for giving me this second opportunity. Okay, there we go. Well, indeed, you introduced me quite well. My name is Eveline van Zeeland. I do a lot of things. As Wouter said, my main activities is that I'm an assistant professor design and marketing at the University of Twente. So I teach design students and I teach design thinking at master level. And we do that in a very interdisciplinary setting. In general, I have a lot of teaching experience also in universities of applied science, also for business students. And design thinking the last years has been my main course that I've been teaching, and therefore we also will have this master class. Please, in general, feel free to ask all your questions. Let's have some quality time together. And I don't know what your background is, so I will start it. I will start it on a basic level, starting with what is design thinking, just as a quick startup for if there's somebody who doesn't know anything about it, which is of course possible. Then I will talk about the design thinking mindset. To me, design thinking is a way of doing a project. It's a way of doing research. My own academic research is also based on design thinking, but it's also a mindset. And well, I think there it starts. And my main part of what I would like to share today with you is how to help students in higher education with design thinking projects or research. And then I will finish with some frequently asked questions that I got from teachers. And of course, there's all room for your questions. Okay, let's start. Let's start with just a general introduction of design thinking. And well, then you quite normally start with the definition, and that's already quite a difficult thing. There are many, many, many definitions of design thinking, of designer-led thinking. The definition that I appreciate the most is the definition of Idris Motet: the search for a magical balance between business and art, structure and chaos, intuition and logic, concept and execution, playfulness and formality, and control and empowerment. Why do I personally like specifically this definition the most? Because it shows this two-world perspective. At one side, a very business-oriented perspective, business, structure, logic, execution, formality. And at the other side, this more creative, designerly world, art, chaos, intuition, playfulness. So to me, design thinking is really trying to combine these two worlds into one way of working and doing research. Another way to explain what design thinking is to explain what it is not. I am actually a schooled economist. I studied general economics at the University of Tilburg, and later on I studied psychology. And both economics and psychology are, well, behavioral sciences, and they heavily depend on an analytical mindset. So you are studying what exactly is going on. The opposite is a designerly mindset, which is not studying what is going on, but is studying how could how could the world be going, how could things happen in the world. So the difference between how most of us are schooled, specifically those from behavioral sciences, trained to study the problem, making hypotheses and test them, versus a designerly mindset is not studying the problem, but studying the solution and more future-oriented, how could things work in the future. So the difference between how do things work and how can things work, that's in one word, I think, the major difference. If I look at projects that I'm supervising, for example, a bachelor thesis or a master thesis, then you also see this difference in mindset in how students spend their time. I first was a teacher on a marketing school. And then if students had like 20 weeks to do their project, they would spend 18 weeks of analyzing the problem. They would do an internal analysis, an external analysis. They would talk to consumers. They would talk to stakeholders. And then in the last 2 weeks, they would come with a very quick solution, which is mostly something like change your website, make a new branding strategy, something like that, something that you actually also could have guessed from the beginning. And a designer mindset, a designer approach would spend that same 20 weeks in a different way. Of course, you also start with the problem, but when the most things are there, you are trying to find out and do research actually on ways to roam, which way to roam would probably improve the situation the most. That creates a complete different kind of knowledge and also a complete different way of doing the whole research process. It's not about making a hypothesis and then testing if it's correct. It's really about exploring ways to roam and testing which one has the most likelihood of creating that future situation that you want to create. So it's a really different kind of approach. In this kind of approach, specifically when you do a whole project according to design thinking, you mostly have these steps. And these steps, the most familiar or well-known way to define those steps is the double diamond. And in this double diamond, you have like this problem space, which is the first diamond, and you have this solution space, which is the second diamond. And you see there's a constant change in divergent and convergent. Divergent means going broad, exploring all possible ways. And that's a little bit this creative designerly world of design thinking, and then combining them again, focus and test. And that's perhaps a little bit more that business world in this diagram. In my book, I also use these steps, and in the projects that I do with my students and with my PhDs, I also follow these steps. But there's a big but to this diagram. It's linear. Whereas a design thinking project, it's of course never linear. You have all these iterations. And a lot of times students ask me when they are in the ideate phase, oh, I think we missed a part in the empathize phase, but now I can't go back anymore. Yeah, sure, you can go back if that's needed for your process. So I love this diagram because it is very clear, specifically for students who have no experience, what the general steps are, but it asks, I think, a lot of supervision qualities of the teacher to make sure that's not linear, but it's actually an iterative process. Despite that big but, I will discuss specifically these steps later on, where I will give you some tips for every phase, how to supervise students and guide students to that. But before I do that, a little bit first more on design thinking in general. To me, design thinking in general has some common principles. First, what is really typical about design thinking is you put the user, and in a business context, that's often the customer, but not necessarily, you put the user center stage. That's the really big difference between being an artist and being a design thinker. An artist can make something he or she really likes. A design thinker makes something that solves a problem for a user. So it is not about, do I like my solution, yes or not? It is, does the solution work for the people who it's meant to work for? So it's really, really user oriented. And most of the times this sounds really logical, but specifically when people are starting to design solutions, then you see that they evaluate it based on whether they like it or not. And you really have to force them there. No, it is about, does it work for the user? So this is a message I constantly repeat. Second one, you learn by trying. We don't know how to solve a problem. There is no easy way to a solution. The only way in which we can find out is try things. Does this direction work? If it does, we continue on it. If it doesn't, we go back and try another path to a solution. So trying out what works, what doesn't work is really typical for design thinking. Speed is important, and that doesn't mean that you have to want to take the rigor out of it, but speeding up the process helps students to really get into this production mode of hey, let's try that, let's try that, let's try that, and do it a little bit quick, like a pressure cooker. Because if you would give them all the time, they would start doing what they normally do, and that is analyzing those things. But we don't want to analyze, we want to create things, see if they work. If they don't, we go back and try something else. So some kind of pressure there is helpful, is my experience. Design thinkers also communicate in a visual way. That's the fourth principle. So build with your hands, for example, make diagrams. Work with Lego, work with Playmobil, work with whatever. Try to make your ideas visual, because then you can see it from multiple perspectives. And the last principle, context is key. And I put there with a big remarcation mark, like, whoa, this is really important. And I want to try explain that to you with an example of Rembrandt, the most famous Dutch painter, I would say, and this is one of his works. You can see it in the Mauritshuis. And this is the anatomic lesson of Dr. Tulip. You see Dr. Tulip there on the right. And this is made actually for a building in which the Society of Doctors was housing. And before Rembrandt made this painting, he actually went to that building and he asked, you ordered a painting for me, where will it be in this building? And then he analyzed, how will people see it? Where is the door? Where is the wall on which the painting will be? From which direction will people see it at first? So he was first exploring the context before he actually made the painting. Why is that? Because he wanted to make this painting as impressive as possible. What is, of course, very impressive? Well, that's the dead body there. And he wanted to be like a blow in your face when you first saw this painting. So therefore, he said, okay, if there's the wall and people go in through that door, they will see it from this angle. I have to make this painting in such a way that from this angle, it is the most impressive. Well, I can show that to you digitally. This is how you are meant to see it, from this angle. Now look at the body, look at specifically look at the legs. So this is how you are meant to see this painting if you are in the right direction in the actual building of the Society of Doctors. If you would move to the other side where there's actually no door, so people won't see it from that direction, but if you would do that, I can show it to you, and now look at the legs, you see complete different painting. You see the legs? They're terrible. So this is how you are supposed to see it, and this is how you are seeing it if you're looking to it from a different context. The body is totally out of proportion. Rembrandt was not only magical with light, as you can also see in this painting, he really was able to capture light, but he was also really good in working with perspectives. And that's what you can see here in this painting as well. And therefore, he first studied the context to make sure that his perspectives were in such a way that the painting made the biggest impression. I'm showing you this to let you understand that everything we see, everything we hear is always from a specific context. And that context is really having an impact on how we see the design. So a design thinker always starts and ends with the context. You also see that in how you can summarize a design thinking project. You can always summarize it with the so-called SIMO logic, where the C of SIMO stands actually for the context. So SIMO, the SIMO logic is, for this problem in context C, you can apply this intervention I, which through these mechanisms M provides this possible outcome O. This is actually the conclusion of every design thinking project. So this is also where you can coach students towards. This is what they must be able to provide for in the end. So it starts with the context. Design thinkers always see a problem in their context, and the solution also works in this context. So you start with defining that context. And then Simo says you can apply this intervention. This is your artifact, and the thing you've designed. And of course, during the process, you've designed multiple things, but in the end, you think, well, this is the best possible way to a solution. That's this intervention. In science, it's called an artifact mostly, which through these mechanisms M, this is where actually the literature study comes in. This is the reason why you think this intervention works the most. So what is the logic behind that? What are probably the working mechanisms there, and then will probably provide for this outcome O. I say probably because design thinking is always future oriented, and therefore you never know for sure if it will be the outcome, but you've tested it and you have the best input that it will possibly be like that. Okay, that's for a quick startup in design thinking. Perhaps good to ask Wouter. Are there any questions so far before I continue?
I don't see any in the chat, but maybe someone has a question right now? No, I think not. You can continue.
Okay, then I can continue. Okay, then I go on to the mindset. Like I said, design thinking, it's a way of doing research. My own scientific research is based on it. It's a way of doing a project, but that's all based on some kind of mindset. So I will start with this mindset. And actually, when I teach my students, the first week, I'm only trying to get them in this mindset before we actually do anything. What is this mindset? Well, if you look back and to what I think is one of the first real design thinkers, then I think that's Leonardo da Vinci. Here he is. Leonardo da Vinci was not only the painter of the Mona Lisa, which you can now see in the Louvre, but Leonardo da Vinci was actually also a scientist. He was also inventing the best city. He was inventing military application. He was actually inventing the car. He was inventing the plane. He was inventing a helicopter. So he was trying out all these different things, besides the fact that he was also a gifted painter. In his book, How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, Michael Gelb demonstrates 7 of his principles, and I would say they really reflect the design thinker mindset. It all starts with curiosity. If you are really, really curious, that really fosters your design thinking project. You are trying to find out solutions. That only works if you're curious to what kind of possible ways could there be. The second principle, you experiment and test and try to learn from your mistake. Does this solution work? It does. Oh, I make it better. It does not. I go back and try something else. Also have some refinement of the senses. Also have this intuition. It's a big part actually in the design thinker's way of working. The fourth one, embracing uncertainty and paradox. And to my opinion, this is what most students actually are struggling with, but the ones who really can embrace it actually are the true design thinkers. Because it is future oriented, there's always a bigger degree of uncertainty. You know for sure what happened in the past. You never know for sure what will happen in the future. And good design thinkers can actually work with this uncertainty and use it as a good instrument in their process. Another element, paradox, below the most tough problems for which there is no easy solution. There is no easy solution because there is a paradox lying underneath. For one positive thing, there's something other, another perspective that can work as well. We also call this wicked problems. Those wicked problems always have some kind of paradoxes. And Da Vinci was actually using these paradoxes to come to a solution. A great example of somebody who is really using paradox as well as a way to a solution is Kees Dorst. I will not discuss his work in this masterclass, but if you want to do some future reading, I can really advise the work of Kees Dorst. He also has an interesting talk about using paradox. The fifth principle is balancing science and art. It's a little bit these two worlds I was also talking about at the beginning of this masterclass. And then also balance between mind and body. And finally, appreciate the interconnectedness of everything. So don't see that as a problem, but actually appreciate it. To me, actually, if we learn from Leonardo da Vinci and take them into these 7 lessons, you already get a very good impression of what design thinkers make so unique, what they are good at. From Da Vinci to me, perhaps not to you, but to me, it's only a small step to my favorite scientist, Einstein. And one of his quotes is, "Creativity is intelligence having fun." To me, this quote is the complete design thinking mindset. Creativity is intelligence having fun. In my first lecture of my design thinking courses, this is always very big on the board, and students get a blanco notebook on which I also have written on the top, creativity is intelligence having fun. If you have this like a mantra, I think you capture a design thinking project in a very nice way. Let me discuss this quote a little bit. It starts with creativity. Without creativity, it's impossible to come up to good solutions specifically for difficult problems. You wouldn't have to need design thinking if problems were easily solved. For example, if there's no milk in the refrigerator anymore, well, there's an easy solution. You just go to the supermarket and buy some new milk, problem solved. But you use, of course, design thinking for much more complex problems than that. And to solve them in a, well, sometimes unique or out of the box way, or to deal with all these ambiguities and paradoxes, you need creativity. Creativity is something you actually can train. And it is my opinion also as the most famous TED talk, which states schools are killing creativity. I think we actually do kill creativity. Students have to really get knowledge, and we test them often in multiple choice kind of exams. Well, there's no creativity needed for that. So actually creativity works like a muscle. The more you train it, the more creative you can be. A creative has nothing to do with being a good artist and being able to work well with your hands. Creative has to do with the flexibility of your mind, actually. So is your mind flexible enough to come up with new solution paths? So flexibility of the mind is really something that defines creative thinking. And just like you can train the flexibility of your muscles, you can also train the flexibility of your mind. You can use all kinds of techniques to do so. And in my books, there are a lot. And mostly in my classes, well, I start the lecture with just a small creativity stretching. Besides creativity, a design thinker, of course, also uses its intelligence. we don't want to create a solution, we want to create a very good solution. And therefore, we really have to think through about all the mechanisms that make them work. In my lectures, besides a small exercise in creativity training, every lecture I give my students some sparks of inspiration. So I start with anything. Could be my favorite instrument, a balafon, which you see here behind me. Could be a very interesting theory. Could be the life of a Nobel Prize winner. Could be everything. Always, of course, something to learn from. And of course, I've thought about that because I think it would foster at least some of their projects. Some examples, when I talk about empathy, I just as an inspiration spark, I often like to talk about physical synchronization, how we can experience emotions that actually others are experiencing as well. So if somebody laughs, somebody else will laugh too. If somebody cries, somebody else cries too. That's why we always cry in very sad movies. Well, I think the most beautiful example of that was Rafael Nadal crying when his big friend, but also big opponent, Roger Federer, was stopping with tennis. Well, these kinds of images, I just show them quickly, show the theory of physical synchronization just as a spark of inspiration. Another spark of inspiration is, perhaps you've seen this. This is this famous movie clip. You also can find it on YouTube everywhere, with this strange dancing man. And then all of a sudden somebody else starts joining, and then the group gets bigger and bigger. And this is a typical movie which discusses the tipping point. At some point, one movement, and there's this tipping point. Well, I show them mostly these kinds of inspiration sparks in my lectures a little bit in the back when I want them to think about impact. Or another complete different spark of inspiration. Sometimes I just discuss James Bond and all the inventions and innovations that were part of the movies that mostly later on became reality. So I also call them sparks of inspiration to my students to get them in this mindset, to be curious, to see things, to get theories, to see around the world, that they can also get information from movies. And if you spark them enough, this process, they will start do that by themselves as well. And then you get actually these really grounded, good ideas. Literature is a part of this intelligence as well, so specifically for scientific projects, of course. And then the last one, fun. I really think that in general, research is fun, and that design thinking projects should be fun too, although they're sometimes really, really difficult. If you can create this fun kind of mode, you also create a vibe around your solution. And you need this vibe to actually make the solution in the end work. So creating this fun vibe is really important element of my work. And I use a lot of creative techniques, story cubes, Lego, whatever. And I do that in class. So I don't say do this at home. No, we do this in class and have some fun and have some laugh together. Here you see us working in the design lab. And if you do that together and people can demonstrate their ideas, you see the girl who's here in the middle really proud. We just found out all these ideas. If you get this atmosphere, that really fosters the project. On the upper left, students were having all their ideas on one big table, and they were making with red lines like a detective map out of it. So they were actually connecting the dots. And then they felt they needed a better overview on that, and they literally went standing on their chairs. So these things are, I think, happening. If these things are happening in class, students are really trying to combine creativity, intelligence, and fun by just doing this all together. So the most of the creative work I let my students actually do in class. If I say, okay, make a good idea at home, they won't come up with it. You have to supply them with all these techniques, all these, and just foster this process a little bit. Besides the principles of Da Vinci, besides the creativity, intelligence, and fun principle of Einstein, I think if we talk about the mindset of a design thinker, we also have to talk about ethics. I don't want to teach my students into becoming design thinkers. I want them to teach them into becoming responsible design thinkers. And I love to quote Tim Brown, which could be seen as like the godfather of modern design thinking. I think, well, he didn't invent it, but he made it big. I love to quote from his lovely book, Change by Design. And there he has this quote on social media apps. And he says, if we design social media applications to be enticing and addictive, then we are doing so because we wish for that outcome. If we don't wish what we get, then we are being very poor designers. Design thinkers have a responsibility to understand the outcomes they're designing for and to be conscious about the choices they're making. So in other words, if Facebook or any other social media app is addictive, then it's because it's designed to be addictive. And I think that we are really educating responsible design thinkers, which must be really aware of the intentions they have with their solutions. Therefore, I also like this other quote from Tim Brown, but I'm actually a schooled economist, so I like the invisible hand of Adam Smith. But Tim Brown responds to that and says, design thinking is not the invisible hand, it's intentional. Things happen for a reason, and we create that reason if we are designing for that. So I think it's very well you have some exercises to do that to make students aware what are possible effects of your design. And if they are negative or things you don't wish for, how can you actually change that? Okay, so far the design thinking mindset. Now let's go to the main part of this masterclass, how to help students. And well, I think here we also have to help each other as teachers. So I would just love to share my experiences and things that I've tried out and see what worked or didn't work. And well, if in the end you want to share some of your tips and tricks, please do. We are all together on this one. But I will start with what I think students really need here, specifically when they have no experience with design thinking. So that's my basic point here. I also teach industrial designers, of course. They have a lot of experience in designerly ways of thinking. But now I'm focusing my story on students that don't have experience in design thinking, how to help them in their first design thinking projects. Well, at first, what most students really suffer from is that it looks so easy, but is in fact really difficult. And then they Google design thinking, and then they find these 5 steps: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. These 2 double diamonds. I will explore them with you in a minute or so. And they say, okay, makes sense. I empathize with the user, I define a problem, I ideate for some solutions, make one into a prototype and test it. Makes sense, looks very easy. So because these steps look so easy, they think, oh yeah, I can do that. And they don't dig into it, a little bit difficult, but actually deeper, but actually they find out that it is really difficult. Just as it is difficult to test a hypothesis, it's also difficult to test a solution direction, or to even come with that solution direction in a way that others didn't come. So they always start like, oh yeah, well, I can do this. And then after a couple of weeks, they're like, phew. So they actually really a lot of help them. It's not enough to just explain the 5 steps. It's really, they need more. One thing that is actually making some lives of some students more difficult is that they're actually being judged on the final product. So they're actually judged on their own solution, which is okay if they have unlimited amount of time. But design thinking is really about trying solutions and see if they work, but they could just as well also not work. And if they are judged on the final outcome, they will not focus on what's not working, of course, whereas this is actually really important for design thinking, because we want solutions that actually solve problems for users. So I think the first thing we as teachers can do to help our students is to make sure that they're judged on the process and not on their final outcome. Another thing we can do to really help them is to have this methodological approach. And I think also this is where my book on design thinking deviates from other books on design thinking, which are good as well. So I'm not judging the other books, but what was, I think, a little bit missing was this methodological approach that I think students in higher education really need. Also because they're used to that, and also because we want rigor in the projects, not only relevance, we also want it to be really good scientific projects. So for each phase, it's very important to help them understand what kind of methods or techniques or tools are you actually going to use. What do you think you have to make care for? You discuss these methods and tools. Who are you involving there as stakeholders or as a target group? Students are not making this whole map in the beginning because they simply can't, because what you prototype depends on what you ideate, and what you ideate depends on your define phase. So they do this for every separate step. And for every separate step, we start with, okay, what is the main thing you want to find out? Who do you involve? But specifically, which methods and tools do you want to use here? What do you need to look out for? And then when are you happy, and are you going to the next phase? Again, it is a linear way of describing it. I think specifically for starting students, that's nice. But the milestone, of course, doesn't mean you can never go back. It's actually, of course, a very iterative process. Okay, let me go through that process. Let me go back to this double diamond. And then again, have in mind that it's in fact not linear. And I want to go to each of these steps and then discuss a little bit what I see students are struggling with and how you can help them with that. A design thinking project starts with empathizing. You are creating a solution for somebody. So you first have to understand what that somebody is actually experiencing. I really love the word empathize here. Empathy means standing in the shoes of others. It means trying to put your mind into the mind of the person you are actually solving a problem for. So empathizing is I think a very, I think in general in science we can use that word more, and that we really try to pay our attention to what is somebody experiencing before we try to solve it. It also helps to reduce the normative elements a little bit. In this empathize phase, what I see students are struggling with is, first of all, how do I study this? Most students had in their education have like two types of research in their back pocket. We can do a survey or we can interview them. Of course, there are multiple ways of doing research, but that's what most students are experienced with, doing a survey or doing interview. Whereas when we are actually empathizing, we might have other tools and techniques in our toolbox. Some are actually interview techniques, but not the general interviews that students do. Techniques that I like a lot, there are more in my book, but just to take out some, are the really mapping tools, because they make it visual, like customer journey mapping and like empathy mapping. Well, the word already says it. But I also really like the thinking hats of De Bono as an interview technique, going through all these different perspectives. Or, for example, this flight to the future, where you really make a mental time travel to the future and let people discuss what they're actually seeing for the future, and then return to the now. How do we get there? So, of course, these are also interviewing techniques, but really based on other techniques than they're normally common with. So the first thing that students need help with is to fill their toolbox a little bit with all these kinds of techniques that really can help you empathize. And there, like I said, there are much more than these four, and it also really deviates for each project which one is most applicable. But yeah, here you need different ways to roam than the classical survey, at least. Another really thing that students need help with is what I call analysis paralysis. In other words, this first phase of a design thinking project looks the most to normal research. And I say normal between brackets because I don't like the discussion like classical and modern, but I think you know what I mean. So this empathize phase looks the most as this analyzing phase that students are used to for when doing research. And then they have this chance of sticking into that too long. Sometimes because they keep on searching themselves, sometimes also because their teachers are actually asking, oh, you also have to dig into this, and oh, you also have to dig into that. I want to repeat this time framing element that I did in the beginning. If you have like 20 weeks for a project, a design thinker spends this 20 weeks different than a behavioral scientist. A behavioral scientist really spends 18 weeks of this 20 on analysis and the last weeks on what can you learn from that and what are paths to the future. A design thinker who spends only a couple of weeks on analysis and then tries to discover possible ways to the future and actually test those. So if we spend too much time in the beginning, mostly then, since most education projects have a fixed amount of time, no, it's not a limited time for no project. So if they keep on going in this first phase too long and too long and too long because they keep on analyzing, then they won't have the time for actually what they're supposed to do, testing solution directions. So you really need to help them with, okay, what do you know right now? Of course, you want to know more, but do you think you've captured most of the thoughts of your users? You've captured most of the things you want to empathize with? If so, then let's continue. If you further on you realize, oh, I also need to know that, we go back. So they really need a teacher here to say, okay, enough is enough, let's go on. Mostly I use a personal experience. I did my PhD on trust. It was called Designing for Trust, my PhD. And if you Google Scholar the trust, you get more than 2 million literature hits. At the first day of my PhD, I was already knowing for sure I could never read it all. So you are always making a selection. And that's what students really find difficult in this first phase. At some point, you just have to say, okay, I don't know everything. It's impossible to know everything. But for this project, I've empathized enough. They really need help there. Okay, if they have collected all these sounds of the user and really empathize with them, again, that's a diverging phase, then they need to combine all these sounds of the user into one design challenge. This is a converging phase. This is a phase where I really take my students by the hand if they're not experienced. To my opinion, they found this phase the most difficult one. And that's because there are actually happening multiple things. First of all, they have this big mountain of information from the empathize phase. They have to make some kind of logic out of that, some kind of tangle of problems, some kind of mind map. And from that, they have to distract the design challenge. And to fuel that design challenge, it also really helps to create some design principles. These are the steps students have to undertake in this phase. And actually, these are pretty difficult. For some already, the first step is really difficult to get from this really big mountain of information, one tangle of problems. I think I've also worked with businesses and organizations. There, this step actually goes pretty easy. So at the professional level, I see that people are used to connect the dots a little bit and to come up with this one tangle of problems that summarizes this big mountain of information. But unexperienced students really have difficulties with this, I found out, and therefore I tried to find the solution, and I came up with the solution from educational science, where they came up with this model called the 5 C's. And it's a step-by-step procedure to go from this big mountain of information to like a mind map. So first, do you comprehend and understand everything you have collected? Then everything collected, make them in little puzzle pieces or little chunks. So interview with person A is a chunk, interview with person B is a chunk, reading this part of literature is a chunk, so this desk research is a chunk. So you have all these puzzle pieces, and then you summarize them in like one small linear, and then you give that summarize one conceptual term. So you conceptualize, and then you have on every chunk just one word, and then you can connect the words. So again, more experienced students or professionals don't need it. They make a tangle of problems or like a mind map out of themselves. But unexperienced students, I found out this really helped them. Also to make this step visible for others, because that's also something. You have to be able to show to your supervisors how you came from this empathize phase to one design challenge. And if you can show that in a more methodological way, I've used these steps to get there, you can also make others more easily part of your process. So it also helps to get others along with what you're actually doing. Okay, then they have to define this design challenge. A design-oriented project always starts the same way. It always starts with a how might we question. How might we create this, or how can we? So I always use the words how can or how might as a starting for a question. Here is where you can see the difference between a more behavioral scientist question and a design question. A behavioral scientist question, for example, if we take COVID as a starting point, that's something we all experienced. Then, for example, a behavioral scientist would ask the question, why do some people get vaccinated and others not? Whereas a design thinker would raise the question, how might we increase the level of vaccination? So how can we actually change something? Again, a behavioral scientist tries to find out how the world works, understands how the world works, so asks a lot of why questions. Design thinkers are solving solutions. So it always starts with something you want to get out. How might we? How can we do that? But if you have a specific problem, it is actually really easy to come up with a how might we question or a how can we question. For example, I just did it with COVID. How can we increase the vaccination ratio? But actually, if you have this tangle of problems, you cannot only make one how might we question, you can make up till 100. That's also really what I force my students to do in this phase. So your brain automatically works very effectively. So if you say, okay, I have this tangle of problems, now turn it into a question. Okay, I did it. But actually how you frame this question is really important for the rest of your course. Here, really framing takes a role. So my students always get the exercise to make like 100 how might we question based on their own tangle of problems, and then to see how different frames are actually in there, and then in the end make the best one. Also, actually, when I teach professionals or in business, for example, also then we have this exercise of making actually a lot of how might we question to in the end select one. So here the difficulty is that you jump too quickly to a how might we question, whereas there is actually a framing exercise lying underneath. And then, important, check if it's actually a good question. A good design thinking question is always user-centered. It's always taking the human being who is having a problem or having a challenge as its starting point. It is also important to have the right scope, and this is a little bit a question of intuition. It should be broad enough so you have the freedom to explore all these paths to a solution, but of course it should also be narrow enough to make sense. You cannot solve the whole world in one day. So somewhere on this axis between very broad and very narrow, a design thinking scope lies. This is very difficult also for us as teacher, but sparring about that, being their sparring partner on this is important. How might we question always uses action-oriented verbs. How might we create? How can we bring? Blah, 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 blah. How can we take care of? Blah, 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 blah. So it always has some action-oriented verbs. And then I think the most important criteria, it's assumption-free. What I mean with assumption-free is mostly, also for professionals and not only for students, mostly if I let people formulate a design question, actually their preferred solution is already in the question. For example, how can we use AI to create better customer experience? Then their solution direction, AI, is already part of the question. It should, of course, actually be how can we create better customer experience in order to blah, 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 blah. But mostly people already, when they are trying to make a question, they already have their first solution in their head. So they are actually already including this in their question. How can we use AI to? How can we use virtual reality to? Well, then actually the solution direction is already in the question. So that should never be the case for a good design thinking question. So this is really something you as a teacher have a role in to get that direction of the solution out of the question. And then if they finally have a good design thinking question to start the rest of their process with, it's very nice to attach some design principles to that. Well, in industrial design and in engineering, these design principles are mostly material based. That's not what I mean here. Also for design thinking for social projects or for business innovation, there you also as well can use design principles. For example, the core values of an organization might very well be also design principles. If in the core value of the organization, circularity or inclusiveness plays a big role, then that's a design principle you also want to have for this project. So it can be really value-based principles, but sometimes it can also be aesthetic principles. It can also be personal values that you bring into your project. For example, for every design project that I actually do in combination with business or for science, I personally always have my personal principle in there. I want it to be kick-ass cool, not just cool, but kick-ass cool, because that's creating this wow factor around the project, and I only want to do wow projects. So to me, I'm constantly ticking the box. Do I really am I still on track making it a kick-ass project and not just a cool project? And if I'm not, how can I change it so that it does? So these principles help you to steer the project into a wish direction based on values or vibe or something like that. Once I had a student who did a project for women actually who were facing problems with their body after birth. And the whole project was about how those problems could be solved. But during her empathize phase, she experienced that these women were actually really ashamed of these problems that they were having. So besides the design challenge, which was focused on solving the problems, she put the design principle there that she wanted to break taboos with her project so that people wouldn't feel ashamed anymore. I'm sharing this with you so you can get that this design principle can really put another accent, another sauce on your project, and really turning it in something that has impact. So design principles and impact mostly are strongly related. Okay, then you have the design challenge, you have some design principles. Now you're good to go for the second diamond, which is solution oriented. And then you start with the ideate phase. And the ideate phase is actually really a research phase. In this research phase, you don't just come up with a solution, you come up with a lot of solutions. It's a divergent phase. So you are actually researching all different ways to possibly create a solution for your design challenge. Here, I always reflect to Linus Pauling, who didn't win the Nobel Prize once, but actually twice. So impressive. And I quote from him, to have a good idea, you first must have lots of ideas. Lots and lots and lots. So creating finally a very good idea for a solution actually takes a lot of time and effort. You really need to create like hundreds or perhaps even thousands possible solution directions before you actually can come up with a very good one. To me, this ideate phase always begins with a literature study and a study for best practices. So you have now your design challenge. Now it's your goal to come up with as many solutions as possible. Again, it's a divergent phase, so you are actually researching solutions. So where can you look for? You can first look into literature. On this type of topic, what has people from science already suggested? You can look at best practices. So on this kind of topic, what kind of solutions do I already see in practice? And then above that, you can use creative techniques, of which you see many in my book, to come up with solutions yourself. So you use as inspiration what do others already saw as solution directions, and you use a lot of creative techniques to in the end come up with a big mountain of solutions. If you have 10, you can combine 1 or 2 into one prototype, or perhaps you make 2 or 3 prototypes and then you test it. So then we come to the final stage. But then again, don't forget there are actually a lot of iterations there in which you build 1 or 2 prototypes and you test it for its effectiveness in solving the problem. Sometimes at some universities of applied science, I see that the teachers skip the test phase, so they stop with only prototyping. To me, then it's not a design thinking project. Not at all. Because like I said in the beginning, the difference between art and design thinking is that an artist is trying to make something that he or she finds beautiful. A design thinker is making something that is actually solving the problem for the user. And therefore, this test phase is absolute super important for the design thinking phase. You are not just building a prototype, you're testing it for its effectiveness in being a solution for the user. So without this test, well, it's not a design thinking project for me. And specifically, if we're talking about higher education, so universities and universities of applied science, prototype is just a means to create knowledge. And this testing, this evaluation of this prototype is actually the way to create knowledge. So prototype and test is really the last phase. Here, students have a lot of difficulties, predominantly students who don't have a design background. They actually don't have an idea on what actually the word prototype means. And so a lot of students came to me and said, Eveline, what's a prototype? Well, which is actually a very interesting question. I just returned from a conference in Milan on the design school of Polytechnic University, 80 design researchers all together. And the big discussion during the conference was, what is actually a prototype? So also designers don't really know. A prototype can be a lot of things. It can be really like a mock-up of something visual, like architects, for example, make. And you can also make that, of course, into a virtual solution. But it can also be just a drawing, like Leonardo da Vinci made a lot in his famous notebooks. Or it can also just be something you made with Lego, like a solution that you built and that's just worked out in Lego. It can be from a simple drawing to a complete online digital a reflection of your idea. It can be anything. As long as you can create knowledge out of your prototype, it's a prototype. And then again, this prototype and testing really come together. Your prototype is a means to test whether or not your solution direction is actually working, is actually solving this problem. And that's the type of knowledge you want to get out of it. And the idea is to do that in the most effective way. If a simple sketch is already doing the job, then don't make a 3D model, just make that simple sketch. So a prototype is anything that can help you to understand whether or not your solution direction is actually probably working in practice, yes or no. Something you create knowledge from. Most business students that I teach actually just make storyboards, sketches, small Lego models, something like that. It is actually more the real design students who make often the prototypes on the right. But I must say AI is really helping a lot here. We just did a project with students on building a new neighborhood, and they just used AI to create a lovely image of their ideas. So of course, new techniques are helping students here a lot. The thing I teach or focus them the most in this phase, on this prototyping phase, is to deal with their perfectionism. A good prototype you must be able to throw in the garbage bin the moment you find out that it's not doing its job. But if people create something, they're actually really proud of it. Perhaps you showed that image of these students that I showed you earlier, where they were all pointing to all their ideas. People who are creating ideas are always very proud of those ideas, and they want to show them to the world. And if they want to show them to the world, they make it more beautiful and beautiful. And every design thinking, also for business, if I have a design thinking workshop with a group of business professionals and we start prototyping, they immediately start to take pictures of their prototypes and send it to the neighbor in their network, like, see what I've made. That's very logical and it's very human, but there's a big but. At the moment you start to take pictures of, look what kind of prototype I've made, you'll actually fall in love with it a little bit. And we don't want that, because we making that prototype just to get the knowledge out of that to whether or not the solution direction is working. And if it's not working, we have to throw this prototype in the garbage bin and make something else. So students in my classes are only allowed to spend a very limited amount of time to prototyping and to see it like a movie set, where just the look and feel is so that it looks like a country and western movie, but actually behind the wood there's nothing. So you make it like a film set. It looks great, but you can turn it away if you don't need it anymore. Prototyping is really the phase that has a lot of iterations. You build something, you test it, you see, they really didn't know how to deal with that function, let's change it again. And because that is really an iterative phase, students mostly don't write down all the steps that they did, and mostly they only show the final version. Which makes sense, because mostly students have the idea that they get judged actually on their final product. But if you want to communicate how you get there, you actually really helping to show that journey, to not only see the final result, but to actually show the path on how you get there. So here again, a little bit of planning and having this methodological approach. What was my first version? What were the users saying about it? What kind of adjustment did I made? What was the new version? To really write that down serves two reasons. A, you really can show your process to the one who's supervising you. That has an educational reason. And two, also for business, this holds. It really helps to communicate not only the final destination, but also the journey. Then, if you have this prototype, of course, you're going to test it. And again, what I'm really doing in my book, because it's really meant for higher education, is to have this methodological approach. And of course, this really helps for is really necessary for the test phase. So students always must make a test plan, not a complete booklet, just one A4, like what are you actually testing? Is it one or more prototypes? How will you test it? Type 1 or type 2? A type 1 test is with the user itself, which is of course always preferable, but not always possible. For example, if the target group is children or patients or other vulnerable groups, then you cannot even test it with the user. So type 1 is always what we want, but it's not always possible. And or are you making type 2 test? A type 2 test is anybody else. So that can be a peer, that can be an expert, that can be an employee of the organization. So are you testing it directly with the user, or are you testing it with somebody else? And why are you doing that? Well, that's of course important to be aware of. What form of testing are you using? Is it a real user test? Do you show a simulation? Is it more like a demo? Is it more like a walkthrough where you show people all the steps? So what kind of test technique are you actually using? What kind of test criteria do you hold on to that? Do you use the same test criteria for every attribute of your design or not? How are you collecting the data? Do you do that by observation? Do you do it by a survey? Do you do it by the interview? Or do you do it mixed method? How big is your sample and who do you want to be in it? These are the main questions you want students to think about. Regarding the size of the sample, the last question, I got a lot of questions from students because in behavioral science, we want actually sample sizes of like 340 or something like that to have all these significant results. Here we are not studying significant results. We are not claiming the world as it is. We're trying to change the world of tomorrow. So we are collecting different kind of knowledge. So in design-oriented projects, it makes much more sense to have small sample sizes for like 5 people in the beginning and to change it a lot. So it's much better to have a lot of small tests than to have one big test. The type of knowledge that you get out of that, you could frame as indications and contraindications. This is really showing the difference between behavioral science. In behavioral science, you're creating a hypothesis and then you're testing whether or not the hypothesis is true. Here, we are not studying the actual world, but we are studying the world of tomorrow. And we are solving a problem which is actually changing this world of tomorrow. So we cannot say whether this is true or not true. That's not something we are actually studying. What we are studying is, do we have signals that actually say, yeah, that is the right way if you want to solve that problem? Or are there signals that say, no, if you do this, probably your problem will deviate in a different direction. So we are collecting knowledge, signals that indicate or contraindicate whether or not our solution direction is on the right track towards creating this preferred outcome. That's really something else than hypothesis testing. We are not testing hypothesis. We are creating a solution direction, turning that into a prototype, and then see whether or not we get the signals, if it works or not works. Unexperienced students mostly have only indications the first time when they show a prototype, because they're actually really proud of their solution, and then they show it to users with a lot of enthusiasm, and then all these users say at first, yeah, sounds really interesting. Then of course they say but this or but that, but the students only hear, oh yeah, they were really interested, and they say, oh, we only have signals of confirmation. Well, then, you know, they have a long way to go to become a real design thinker. Because, well, I've never seen in the first prototype testing round that, oh yeah, really, this is all green light. And then I show them the example of Dyson, the famous vacuum cleaner, who actually had to build more than 5,000 prototypes to get to a sellable machine. So you'll hardly ever get this on the first round of prototyping. Actually, what I want is, specifically in this first rounds of testing, I want these contraindications, because these contraindications are actually really helping the design process to get the prototype better and better and better. So here you really see mostly the difference between unexperienced and experienced design thinkers. Unexperienced design thinkers are a little bit in love with their own idea and want others to be in love with it too. And more experienced design thinkers know, oh no, it's a journey and I want to learn as much as possible to get in the end to the best destination. After each test, it's always important to reflect and to see, okay, what is it that I'm going to do? And this is also students really need help with. Can you already move to implementation? Well, after the first test, hardly. But after a couple of tests, at some point, you have to make that decision. Do you just want to do an extra test? Are the results so blurry that you say, no, let's do an extra test, perhaps now not with type 1 users, but now with type 2 experts? Perhaps the scenario specifically in the beginning, if you get a lot of contraindications, adapt and retest. Okay, we get a lot of contraindications. Let's change our prototype and retest. And sometimes you hear back from the test that, no, this is really the wrong solution path. You studied it really well and you thought this was the best direction, but it simply wasn't. And then you go back to your design table, ideate again, make a new prototype, and test, of course, that prototype. Okay, that was going through the whole steps, or actually cycle of design thinking, and how I think you can help students in going through that process successfully. Now I want to finish with 3 questions that a lot of teachers are asking me, so frequently asked questions to me, and then we have the room for all your questions or to discuss it a little bit. Well, 3 questions that I get a lot is how to get depth and rigor in the project. That's one of the first ones. In science, we have this rigor relevance debate. So a lot of science is actually having a lot of rigor, but it's not relevant. Nobody in practice is using it. So we say there's this science practice gap. Scientists are doing this and practitioners are interested in something really different. So we say that a lot of behavioral science scores very high on rigor and very low on relevance. And then for design thinking projects, because it starts with an actual problem from the field, and the success is also completely based on whether or not it's solving this problem, it automatically has a lot of relevance. So where behavioral science scores high on rigor, mostly a design thinking project almost automatically scores high on relevance. Does that mean that there's no rigor in it? No, not at all. You have to make it in it. So for every project, you can make more or less rigor in it. Of course, that rigor has much more to do with the choices that the researcher, or in this case, the student, is actually making. So one way to create rigor in it is to start the ideate phase with a big literature study. What does science already know about how I can solve this problem? One way to create rigor in it is to have a lot of iterations in prototype and testing. Really have really exploring all the elements of your solution. One way to get rigor in it is to use sophisticated methods in this empathize phase, for example. So yes, a design thinking project is automatically scoring high on relevance. It can also score high on rigor, but then you really have to focus on that, like for any project, of course. But I want to remind you of it that also on scientific level, we do design thinking. Design thinking is not only made for practice, it's also for science. And so rigor has much more to do with the choices you're actually making. And that's why I try to make my book a very methodological book. So this depth is more in it. Second question, this is what reflecting, which has something to do with that. What we really must understand is that design thinking creates a different type of knowledge than behavioral science. Behavioral science is used on deduction and induction. So proving that something must be or proving that something actually is. Design thinking is based on abduction. It proves that something may be, which is also always reflecting some kind of uncertainty, which is of course the case that it's future oriented. And because it proves that something may be, because there's abduction, it also for some people feels less rigorous. But rigorous has nothing to do with the certainty of which you can claim something, but much more on the choices you make for your process. Because it's based on abduction, also how you deal with validity is different. In design thinking, pragmatic validity is a very important element of validity, which is not the case in other types of projects. So rigor gets different shape than in behavioral science, but it's not means that it's not there. Another questions that I got a lot from teachers is, should implementation be part of the deal? If you're asking me, I would say no. Of course, we are creating solutions that help, so you want them to get implemented at some point in time. But if we look at the educational context, then everything is time bound, at least to my experience. And what we want is that students are not judged by the quality of the final result in the fact that if it's implementable or not. Perhaps they've explored a very interesting solution route and then came to the conclusion that in the end it's not the best one. So if you want to create a space for students to learn from mistakes, to experiment, to try different paths to solution, which is typical design thinking, you are not asking from them to automatically also implement their idea. Because implementation you only do if you have a very good idea. And that is mostly in time-bound projects really difficult. So I would say no, but that doesn't mean, of course, that you really want students to think about implementation or to have knowledge about that. A third question that I get a lot from teachers is how to grade design thinking projects, which I can imagine. How I grade my students' projects is with the CCP model of Simons. The CCP model stands for context, content, and process. So how well did they map the context? Like I discussed in the beginning, design thinking is always discussing a solution within the frame of a context. How well did they put content in it? Did they do the good literature study for ideation? Did they use interesting techniques and found interesting things in the empathize phase, for example? And how well did they design and orchestrate the complete process? Can you really see it as a journey, and can you go along on that journey? Personally, I add to the CCP model of Simons their visual presentation and also the storytelling, because I think that a good design thinker should not only be able to create a good solution, but also to sell that solution. But yeah, well, then again, I'm an assistant professor design and marketing. So perhaps that's more a personal element that I think is good, but a good idea is worth nothing if it remains lying in a desk somewhere. It is only worth something if others see the value of it too. So I want them to be able to communicate that value. Okay, that with respect to what I would like to share with you today. Well, now I'm of course very curious if you have any questions, remarks, things you want to discuss. So I'm closing the sharing of this masterclass, and I'm really curious. So express your thoughts.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but maybe someone just wants to ask something here in the masterclass.
Rob.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting masterclass, Eveline. Yeah, my question is actually about the rigor, the rigor, the level of justification. I wrote down my question: which elements of more traditional academic research would you expect to see in a design thinking report? So how do you justify your, and of course you've talked about it a lot, but I think what we are struggling with in our academy and also in our course is basically the reliability and the validity. How do students well justify their choices? And I understand how you do it, but we are also looking for a discussion. For example, we're looking for the correct ways of referencing. We're looking for some formal requirements. Yeah, besides what you've been talking about today. And that's also because we are sort of in transition from a more traditional approach to a more design thinking approach, and most teachers are also classically trained. I know you don't like the dichotomy between classical and but that's something that we struggle with. So yeah, that's so. What is your take on this? Which formal requirements?
Well, the requirements, for example, on using references is just the same as classical. I don't see why that's any different. Also, my students have to do just as well a literature study. They only do it at another time framing. Mostly on a classical project, they start with a literature study to come up with a theoretical framework, and then they test that theoretical framework. Here, we first have this first round of problem identification, and I like to use literature to get them into this exploration round of creating good ideas. So you just use it as well, literature. They also write it down exactly on the same way, but a little bit on a different stage of their project. So references and using literature is to my the same. And also the discussion section is exactly the same, but it has different evaluation criteria than normal or classical research. So I think it is not, all the elements are there the same. My work is also published in exactly the same type of journals as more classical journals, but you use different criteria. And here specifically reliability and validity get a different meaning. Reliability mostly is regarding the sample size. If you look at classical and of course more elements, but sample size is a big element there, and that is something you really do differently in this project, because it simply makes more sense to make more small iterations. That's actually more reliable for a design thinking project than just one project and discussing that with 100 people. If you look at for example, my own, one of my PhD studies, I used sample sizes in the beginning of like 10, 12 people. And then in my final stage, I went to 20 or 50 people, which is actually quite normal scientific amount of people. So you raise the sample size the further you get in your prototype, which is not something you can do with young students, but something you can expect from your bachelor or master students, for example. But reliability, therefore, in this case, it has to do I get the most reliable information, whether or not my solution direction is heading towards the right direction? That's something else than asking yourself, can I reliably say that my hypothesis is true? So therefore, reliability is just has a different meaning here, and same holds for validity. There is this excellent paper by Gregor and Hefner. I can send it to Wouter, and he can send it then to you when he sends these slides as well. And that paper first starts about innovation and other things, but in the end of the paper, they make a publication scheme for design-oriented research. And so they really set down all the chapters or sections they want to be there, what should be there in the discussion. And there you can also see how that deviates from normal papers. Normal papers have introduction, literature, method, results, discussion. And design-oriented paper, that's a little bit different, specifically on the end, because then we evaluate the artifact and then do the discussion. So it's a little bit, there's a little bit of change, but there's an excellent, this question is already worked out, and I will send it to you and to everybody if the others wanted to.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Is that solving your problem a bit, Rob?
Yeah. My wicked problem.
I saw in the chat that Jelena had the same question, I think, and she just wrote that you answered her question. Is that right, Jelena? Is your question answered by this?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the structure of the thesis, because this is the first time I'm supervising design-oriented thesis, and I really don't know how to approach it or what to expect from the student, how much in depth they should go in each of these sections. So I've seen so many different versions of design oriented, so I don't know which one is right or adequate or expected, or so if you can just give us some suggestions regarding the structure. Thank you.
Yeah, I always use, and actually it's the most cited paper in design science research, the Gregor and Hefner paper. So I will just send it to you afterwards. It gives the best possible structure, and you see, that actually all serious design-oriented scientific articles are referring to that, actually. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
But all teachers who first supervise design are struggling with this, so Rob actually saying the same. I had also the same years ago. I had the first design. This is really a struggle point, because we have to actually reframe our own definitions of reliability, of what is good, of we have to reframe that a little bit. So we have the same criteria, but they have different definitions in design thinking, and we have to set those new definitions. And that's in every university a difficult process. Yeah,
and it's also difficult to include literature review, because I see my students just skipping the literature review and going straight to the problem, and then addressing the problem and straight to methodology, and then I'm like, okay, but where is it situated within the literature? So I don't know how much I should be demanding in terms of that, because I'm a classical researcher, but then how do I apply that into design thinking?
Well, I'm demanding a high level of literature from my students, actually, because to my respect, science is all about standing on the shoulders of others. And that's actually what you do with your literature research. What have others already found out, and how are you contributing to that? But here, mostly that has the case of what do they already know about the world, and what don't they know about the world, and what they don't know is then what you are going to add. In a designerly approach, it's not about what you know about the world, but about what you can change about the world. So therefore, literature has a different purpose. But again, how you are changing something is again standing on the shoulders of other people. They have found out or tried different ways to roam just as well. Perhaps they didn't make it explicit. Or sometimes, for example, I did a chatbot study that was, could I create a chatbot dialogue in a patient relationship that was creating trust? That was my design question. Can I create trust in a chatbot dialogue with patients? And then I used a psychology stereotype model, which says we are observing people as warm or competent. And then I thought, I can use these as design principles for my design process. I can try to build a warm chatbot, and I can try to build a competent chatbot, and then see what it does to trust. So you still need your inspiration from literature, see what others already find out, and see how you can stand on that. But you just stand on it on a different way, because you're using it for a solution is different than adding a new mediator or moderator to the model, which is what more classical science is doing. Yeah. But I teach my student, yeah, you stand on the shoulders of others in everything you do, and there is the role of literature. Yeah.
And you do that in the ideate phase more so than you do in the empathize phase, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although sometimes for some questions in the empathize phase, it can also, of course, be very valuable.
Wow.
Yeah. I just did a project with people going to an elderly home, which is very difficult to empathize with because you cannot talk, because these are actual patients. So you can only talk to the nurses and the family around them. And then, of course, there is so much science on what we know on what elderly are experiencing in this late phase, then it's a source of empathy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can I ask something else?
Yeah, sure.
That's just another question I had. A lot of our students are working with clients, so they start off with sort of a problem. You know, their starting point is a problem that a client has.
Yeah.
But the next thing I tell them is that you're objective researchers, and you should empathize to see if there is a problem behind the problem they're stating.
Yeah.
But most students are very sort of operational in solving a problem that a client has, whereas the design challenge should be, well, adding to that problem might be the same question, or it might be having some, you know, you have to take it a step further. So how do you deal with that issue with students?
Yeah, I also have a lot of projects with that are client-based, and then I'm always in some of the first conversations. I'm there with them because students have this automatic respect for the client, which I think is not more than common sense. I would have the same if I would be 19. So and actually the most difficult problem that I then am experiencing is that actually the client already has a solution thought of for this problem, and they want actually the students to show that it's a good solution or to work out that solution. If that's the case, I actually have to manage the client more than I have to manage the student. Therefore, I want to be there. I think it's really a type of client that all solutions directions are possible. It is very common that the client actually asks, how can we use AI for this? Or how can we use VR for this? Yeah, no, one step back. What's your actual problem? And perhaps AI is a good solution, but perhaps there are other ways to roam that are more cost effective. I don't know. We will find out. So in first start, it's really about managing the client, what actually design thinking project operates, because they are actually, most clients are just expecting deep market research. And that's not what my students are delivering. So that is really something we should help the client with. And in this conversation, I always ask the client, what will happen if my students are not doing this project for you? And if then not some drama happens, then I'm not accepting the case, because there should be something going on, and there should be something to dig in for. The question behind the question, what's happening if we are not doing this? What will then be your problem? For example, users will walk away to some other solution, something like that, and then. So that's what we are really into, because that's what they need to empathize with in the end. We just don't want higher sales or something like that. What most clients want. Yeah, we all want that, but that's not about solving a problem.
Right.
Yeah. But this is difficult, and therefore I think specifically for young students, they just need me to be there in this conversation. Because, and then I'm of course giving them, so I don't want to be there in the whole project. I want to give them all the freedom, but if I'm not handling this first step well with them, they don't have any freedom anymore, because then I already completely blocked to some kind of AI project, which is not design thinking anymore. Yeah.
Very interesting to sit down with the client. We should ask for more time, Marika. Marika is my colleague, so.
Yeah, it actually saves time in the end.
Yeah, in year 3, we have the project with the clients, and all the coaches are always with the first meeting, but also when they're handing in their design brief to give the opportunity to the students that they have the open space to ask questions and not go for the first solution, which is provided with the client. I think that's very, very important. Yeah.
Yeah. That's also what I meant with it. Safe space in the end. Space saves time in the end. If you really invest in the beginning, then the end will. Yeah, if everybody is managed in a way that they get the creative freedom to really explore, well, then you have a very nice project. Yeah.
It's nice to hear all these questions because I can relate to all of them, especially with the clients. That's the most difficult part, because I asked the client to come in like maybe after 3 weeks and then in the end again. But I think we should do it earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it also really helps them to tell what design thinking actually is.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because they're really expecting, a solution, the solution that they come up with.
Indeed, indeed. They think, oh, design thinking is about making a solution. I already have a nice solution and now I have a student to work it out. And then they've Googled design thinking once and they see these 5 steps. Oh yeah, fine, looks good. But they really need to get into this mindset as well. What this mindset actually entails. Yeah. Yeah. That's a difficult thing with design thinking because it's such a hype term. Actually, everybody thinks, oh yeah, you're going to work with post-its a little bit. But of course, it's a methodology. Yeah, it's really a way of solving things. And actually, I haven't had any project in which I didn't have to coach the client in that. Yeah.
That's actually interesting. It's also a bit of jargon. Is design thinking a methodology, or do you have a methodology within the design thinking steps?
Yeah, that's as well. So yeah, I would the word I use the most, but this is really some conceptual confusion indeed. I like to call it an approach, as contrary to a behavioral approach. So to me, it's an approach that entails a mindset, but also entails different methods along the steps of this approach.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, true.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a question. Yeah, so I see the students are writing about design thinking and about the double diamond, and so they discuss that as their methodology. But then they're moving on to the methods themselves, and then elaborate on the interviews or whatever else they do. So where do these discussions sit within the broader thesis? So I don't know where, what comes the first, and do they go together, and in which part of the thesis?
I really recognize that all my students are suffering with this as well. What mostly is a very easy solution is to have one general methodology section in the beginning on what design thinking or design science is, specifically also to a client, but also in general. It is very good that you can work out your methodology. And also there are different interpretations, of course, of design thinking. Do you have more like the IDEO interpretation, or do you use a different one? So I think a general, this is a design thinking thesis, is very interesting to do in the beginning. And then I mostly like for if they really have this empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test kind of structure, then those to me are the 5 next following chapters. And then every chapter starts with the methodology section again. So in this phase, I'm going to ideate. How am I going to do that? What kinds of methods and techniques are I using there? Define and what kind. So for every, therefore they make also a small test plan for every, or a small work plan for every phase.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So every chapter starts with some method, because for empathizing you use methods as well. You use interviewing or observation methods. You use literature methods. You use mostly you apply a lot of different methods there. Also for ideation and also for prototyping. So specifically on those chapters, I think it's very helpful to just start with methods there as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But it makes the most sense, I think, to have the thesis like the journey that students are actually doing. To me, that makes it's the most readable variant. I also had once a complete methodology section in the beginning with the general methodology of design thinking or general approach, and then all the specific methods that were being used. But then it was impossible to understand it as a reader, because actually the output of every phase is the input for the next one. So if you are missing these results part in between, then you think, oh, why did they do that with observation? You only get that if you understand what they try to find out. So to me, that didn't work. It's better to use all these steps, a different set of methodology, specifically in a thesis. Yeah.
Okay, and I have a question regarding the references that you've just mentioned here in chat. Will you compile all of those and the paper that you were referring to and send to us together with slides in email? Will we get the list of all? Okay, that will be really helpful.
Right, Wouter, you're sending the article. I will also, Kees Dorst, I will send you the movie clip too. And the article.
I put the link to the YouTube video also in the chat.
Ah.
But I will put it in the email with the slides as well.
Okay, well, that would be helpful to have it in one place.
And the slides are also in Dutch, Marieke, so I will send you the slides in Dutch then.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that will be very helpful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That is very useful.
Great. Yeah.
Nice. And
I think it was a really nice masterclass, Eveline.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
I've seen it twice now. For 2 weeks we had the same masterclass, but this one is really good because of the questions in the end.
Yeah. So that's a big compliment to you.
Yeah. You did well.
It's a bit of a smaller group, so you feel more,
it's more easy to ask questions.
So.
Yeah.
But it's it's very helpful. I just noticed that I actually pay too little attention to the prototype and the test phase. Well, that is very important for the validity, and we say to students, you can come up with a prototype and that can be your finished product.
Yeah.
Sort of, but that's not that we should really. That's a mental note for myself, but that's a big takeaway.
Are you working at the University of Applied Science?
Yes, in Leeuwarden.
Leeuwarden. I see that on most University of Applied Science that they stop in the prototype phase. And then actually that's taking all the rigor also out of it and all the evaluation. But also it's actually taking all the design thinking character out of it. But you're not the only one. I see that almost everywhere. Yeah.
That's also a feasibility problem, right? So you have to, that's why the speed is important. So you have really set a time frame for every phase or for every. So we have students come up with a mini plan. So we actually copy that idea for their first idea to explore their ideas. So that's really helpful. So they have a timeline. So they have time to do the prototype and the test phase more in a more.
That's it. Indeed, that's it. That. Yeah. They really need at least half of their time for the second diamond, I would say. Yeah.
That's a big takeaway. So great.
Yeah, and in this prototyping and testing and then starting to teach indications versus contraindications, if they start using that language, then the others see, that is the rigor as well. That's our kind of rigor. Understanding what kind of knowledge am I deriving from this prototype and what do I learn from that? And what kind of new principles do I distract from that? That's actually the type of knowledge that a design thinker derives from its research. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, there are even universities of applied science that first said all the projects should be design thinking, and then they find out it's not rigorous anymore, and then they stop doing that. But that's because they made the wrong choices actually because there can still be a lot of rigor in it. Yeah,
I can totally see that happening. Yeah.
Well, if you have any questions at a later point in time, just reach out. I really think we are here to help each other. So we are all teachers in the end.
Yeah. Great.
And I'm also in contact with Rob about a masterclass or a training at the end of August. And on that date, you couldn't be there, Eveline, but next week we are going to speak some other people who are training design thinking. So I hope to find someone in that group for
Okay.
that date.
Yeah, it would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a slow process. We've been talking quite some time to get it happening, and it's going through different layers, management wise. But yeah, we're really in transition to really educate the teachers as well, because yeah, we could do with some calibration, and that's on design thinking.
Yeah, I just did that with the teachers from Avans, University of Applied Science. There we did indeed a train the teacher. And they first had a design sprint of 1 day in which they actually had to do a design thinking process themselves. And then a day of reflection and talking about rigor and all these kind of things, but really experiencing it yourself 1 day. And then they were really like, oh, I'm also really proud. They were all presenting their prototypes and
Making
forgot
pictures.
the whole test phase, for example. And okay, if you are forgetting it, yeah, you're also not demanding it from your students. So that's really fun to do. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, I hope we can pull it off this time, so we can make it work. So
Yeah. And if you want Eveline to be there, we have to pick another date. But I think that's difficult for you, isn't it?
for us,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because you have a team day on that date.
yeah, in the end of August. Yes, that would be. I mean, I've pitched these masterclasses as well, and you know, the usual suspects are joining. But we need to have a broader, you know, sample in the team to really make a change. So the team day is everybody's supposedly is there, so that would be good. And I don't think when the next opportunity is, but if we can find someone who is also, you know, available.
Yeah, the other trainers are also experienced
and
in
experienced, so
design
that's fine, you know. So.
Yeah.
Okay. And for you, Jelena, if you want to do a training with Eveline or someone else, that's also possible for your university.
Well,
So
that
just
would be
reach out.
great. Yeah. So will you send us some information by email, or
Yeah, I can
how
do
will
that.
we be?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that would be useful.
I also spoke with Mike about that.
Mike,
so
okay.
she's
Well,
already
that's great.
she's involved.
Okay, that's great. Okay.
Okay, we'll call it an end, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eveline.
Okay.
Was very
Thank you,
nice.
Eveline.
Thank you,
very
Eveline.
much.
Yeah.
And
In
thank you for
Dutch,
the
graag gedaan.
discussion.
And have a
Yeah.
great day.
Yeah.
You too.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a great
Bye.
weekend.
Thank you very
Have a good
much.
weekend.
Bye-bye.
You're
Bye.
welcome.
Bye.
Bye-bye.